Which way now for the Catholic Church? On his return from Ireland, a weary pope refusing to answer a conservative U.S. prelate's call for him to resign. The Vatican's former ambassador to the U.S., a hardliner on homosexuality, claims Francis knew about sexual misconduct allegations against the former Archbishop of Washington as far back as 2013. The sex abuse scandals keep coming, so do the cover-up claims. What to make of this one from the Vatican's right flank? During the first papal visit to Ireland since 1979, there was contrition over past abuses and plenty of tangible evidence that despite the hundreds of thousands who turned out, the Church's influence is waning in Western Europe's most Catholic nation. Now, what next? A more liberal path? Or will the Church stick to its guns on homosexuality, women's rights, the celibacy of priests? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the pressure on this 81-year-old Pope. And with us to talk about it, Father Aidan Troy, parish priest at St. Joseph's Catholic Church here in Paris. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for joining us from London, journalist and commentator Austin Iveray, the author of The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And from Wellesley, Massachusetts, Michelle Dillon, sociologist at the University of New Hampshire, the author of Post-Secular Catholicism, Relevance and Renewal. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. He's crossed swords before with the current Pope, the hardline former Vatican ambassador to the U.S., claiming a papal cover-up, and in his letter that, quote, the homosexual networks present in the Church must be eradicated. Catherine Viette has more.
Did Pope Francis know about sexual misconduct by a cardinal and help cover it up? Speaking to reporters, the Pope refused to give an answer.
I read the letter this morning. I sincerely suggest that, if you're interested, you read the letter carefully and judge for yourselves. I will not say one word on this. I think it speaks for itself, and you are able to judge by yourselves with professional maturity.
The accusation comes from the Vatican's retired ambassador to the U.S., Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, a hardliner and staunch critic of the direction the Pope's taking the Church. He says Pope Francis was informed back in 2013 about allegations of sexual abuse by Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. But it wasn't until the press got a hold of the story that the former Archbishop of Washington was expelled from the College of Cardinals in July. Vigano's now calling on the Pope to resign.
In this extremely dramatic moment for the Universal Church, he must acknowledge his mistakes and, in keeping with the proclaimed principle of zero tolerance, Pope Francis must be the first to set a good example for cardinals and bishops who covered up McCarrick's abuses and resign along with all of them.
Pope Francis has been working to restore faith in the Catholic Church in the wake of a series of high-profile abuse scandals. Homosexuality has been another hot-button topic, and the Pope was asked his opinion on what to do if a child comes out as gay.
Make some room to let them express themselves. It is one thing when it manifests itself from childhood, when there are a lot of things to be done with psychiatry, or to see how things are. It is another thing when it shows 20 years later.
Considered a progressive Pope, some are surprised and shocked by his therapy comment.
And that last comment you saw in that report prompting a statement from the Vatican saying that the Sovereign Pontiff did not want to evoke this question as, quote, a psychiatric illness. How did you interpret it when he talked about psychiatry, Father Troy?
I thought it was unfortunate, but then who am I to criticize the Pope? I imagine that on the flight back from a very hectic 36 hours in Ireland, I'm not making excuses because he doesn't need me to make excuses. He said something that I'd say on reflection, and I didn't know that statement, is very, very ill-advised to line up, as it were, the sexual orientation and psychiatry. Because if a parent or an adult or a young person chooses, I can remember when I lived in Belfast, there was a very celebrated case of where a certain party, political party, said they had in their employment, a psychiatrist who could change from homosexuality to heterosexuality. It was appalling. It was terrible. And I learned that much. Never, ever, ever line the two up. Because while I might need counselling, you might need counselling, if you say to me, you better see a psychiatrist because of your sexuality, I think you're in very, very dangerous territory. And that's not meant as to add to the criticisms. I just think it was an interview given on a plane, and I would think it would have been better not said.
Austin Ivory, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite wrong to interpret it as meaning that he was talking about what's sometimes called conversion therapy. I don't think he was saying that at all. He was saying, as I understood it when I read it, in adolescence, people often experience identity confusion sexually, and they go through phases. And that's something that often adolescents need help with. He makes a distinction between that kind of adolescent phase and then what one might call a kind of a firm orientation, which is usually established by the 20s. So I didn't interpret it as meaning conversion therapy. And I've noticed that Father James Martin, who's probably the leading expert on this in the Catholic Church, has said what I've said. That's not how he took it.
Overall, the Pope, Austin Ivory, he looked tired. He looked drawn after that trip. And it seems like he's under a lot of pressure.
Well, you know, popes are under a lot of pressure all the time. I think the Vigano letter, which we're no doubt going to discuss, you know, came out of the blue Saturday night, Sunday morning. It's a very unusual, ferocious attack. He had spent 36 hours almost non-stop in Ireland, meeting victims, listening to harrowing stories, encountering large crowds. It's a tiring operation. But, you know, I look at him and I think, well, yes, he gets tired easily, but he bounces back quickly. And everybody who's close to him says he really does have phenomenal energy, phenomenal life in him, tremendous charisma still. There's no signs, I think, of his forces, of his strength in any way giving way. He's obviously just showing his age, but he's still got plenty of energy and verve for the job.
And that letter, is it one prelate gone rogue, or is this part of some concerted campaign?
Actually, that's a great question, because we don't ultimately know how this letter came about. We don't know who planned it. Certainly, it was very well timed. It's strung together in such a way as to cause maximum embarrassment and maximum impact. And it was put out by a website which is notorious for its ferocious traditionalist attacks on Pope Francis. The letter was translated by one of the journalists there. It looks to me like it was fairly coordinated from the same group, I call them Team Burke, who have been very opposed to the Pope really from the beginning. So I think the answer is both. I think, yes, it's part of that a campaign, but I think it's also about an individual prelate full of anger, full of rage, full of guilt, who feels very betrayed and is lashing out, frankly, at everybody he knows and making the most extraordinary allegations. And it's very hard reading the letter to think that we're in the presence here of a balanced individual. He's clearly anxious to get something off his chest.
Michelle Dillon, does the charge seem credible to you?
Well, it's what's interesting to me is that so much of the commentary has been about Francis. And of course, that's what Archbishop Vigano wants. He wants Francis to resign. But if you look at some of the details that he has itemized in this letter, it really is also pointing the finger clearly at Pope Benedict and indeed at John Paul II. And so that really begs the question, you know, why hasn't this been exposed several years ago? So why suddenly now get obsessed with Pope Francis and ask him to resign when we didn't expect the same kind of exemplary leadership from previous popes? And so I think these sorts of questions then beg attention to the overall sort of conservative context within the US, at least, by which Francis, a lot of his initiatives have been received. And these have gotten a further acceleration with the exposure earlier this summer about Cardinal McCarrick. And of course, all of this does raise, beyond the immediate politics of the church and within Rome and among bishops, it's really this larger question within the church more generally as to how decisions get made, who knew what when, and of course the larger questions that clerical culture and collusion bring attention to.
The U.S. Catholic Church, a powerful bloc inside of the Vatican. Michelle Dunn, give us a picture of what it's like inside of the U.S. Catholic Church after these revelations that came out at the start of the month in Pennsylvania with a damning report that looks at abuse against 1,000 victims, it seems.
Yes, well, it's a very complex thing, American Catholicism. My first point always is to remind people that most American Catholics are very moderate Catholics and have been so for many decades, and certainly in the post-Vatican II era. So most Catholics are quite moderate. But a lot of the time, some of the bishops who are quite conservative, they get most of the press. They're the official spokespersons, and they tend to be seen as if then they represent all the voices of Catholics in America, when all my research and other people's research shows that American Catholics are committed to the church, but they disagree with church teachings, particularly on the sort of sex and gender elements, but also on other issues. But they want to be Catholic because they're committed to other aspects, the social justice and other aspects of the church. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind, that American Catholics as a whole are very moderate. Secondly, of course, and we certainly have seen this come to the fore with Francis, is that with his appointments, bringing back to notice the social justice tradition in the church, appointments such as Cardinal Cupich, for example, Cardinal Tobin, they are reminiscent of what the American bishops here were like in the 1980s, when there was really a big commitment to a public Catholicism that engaged with political questions, got to do with economic inequality, for example. And so people's memories can be short, but it's just that because during Benedict, some of the more conservative Catholic bishops, including Archbishop Chaput, for example, in Philadelphia, they've had quite a strong leadership role that sort of people then forget that, in fact, or assume that all bishops are of the same cloth, when in fact they're not. But certainly the revelations coming out all this summer, first with ex-Cardinal McCarrick and now with Pennsylvania, even though the revelations are old news in the sense of the history of the sex abuse, what I think still is awful, that still is an awful thing for American Catholics to have to read about and to hear about. But also, and even a bigger issue in some sense, is the fact that it seems that church officials, despite making some strides, have still not fully been able to come to terms with what is required in order to deal with the abuse and with the culture in the church that allows abuse to take place, and more importantly as well, to cover it up.
And what is required?
Well, I think what we know is that some people would argue that we need a tribunal, and the Pope's own appointed Council for the Protection of Minors recommended such a tribunal back in 2015, still under the leadership now of Cardinal O'Malley from the Boston Archdiocese. But as Mary Collins was quoted extensively in the media while the Pope was in Ireland, it seems that tribunal is not going to happen. Now, she in the past complained that it was insider, Vatican politics that were preventing it. And I don't know, I'm not in the Vatican, I don't know the full story there, but ordinary Catholics cannot understand why the church lacks transparency. And if you're going to deal with these offenses and these serious sins, then they should be done in a more open fashion.
Father Troy, last week the Pope issued this public letter calling on people to speak out when they see abuse. And a priest in the south of France, in Valence, responded to it saying, okay, he launched an online petition calling for the revocation of Cardinal Barbarin, who is the prelate who is accused of covering up the pedophile conduct of a Lyon area priest. What are your thoughts? Was that the right way to go, and should Cardinal Barbarin be revoked?
I don't honestly know enough of the detail of that, but I've been following that very, very closely. But I think, obviously, whenever anybody is named, I think they're entitled to, you know, a fair hearing. I think it's very, very important that people do speak out. And if anyone has an accusation to make, I'm also a great believer in making sure that the civil authority is the ultimate judge of criminality and of whether a thing is really that. I think for far too long, and I'm old enough to remember when within the church we still had many of our canon law teachers telling us that canon law was superior to civil law and that we could deal with it ourselves. Now, if a cardinal is asked to resign, if there is evidence and if that can be proved in a court of law, for instance, then I think, yes, there should be no hiding place from that.
Because one of the resentments against the church is that it's the church trying its own.
Yeah, well, I think that has always been a difficulty, that any group, whether it's police trying police or clergy trying clergy, that's why I think the sooner. I remember I lived in the United States in the 80s, and I was a school counsellor, and it was in California, and there was mandatory reporting at that time. And I remember coming back to Ireland, and I was given school retreats and mentioning this to some of my colleagues who could not believe that you would actually inform the police there and then if you came across anything that was wrong. And I've never forgotten that. I still think that that is a road that the church has yet to learn, that we are not masters of criminality. We may be perpetrators, but we're not masters. And therefore, I think it's terribly important that anything like that be able to be brought to the civil authorities, as well as obviously any internal tribunal that the church needs.
Austin Ivory, before we go to the break, your thoughts on this online petition that was launched by this parish priest here in France?
Yeah, do you know, I'm not really across that, but can I just clarify something that Michelle mentioned, which is the question of bishops being held accountable. It's true that the Pontifical Commission for Minors proposed to the Pope that there be a tribunal in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the Vatican to try bishops. Now, Francis accepted the idea, but when it was examined, they actually came to the conclusion that legally they would have to create a whole new kind of law, a whole new kind of offence. And they decided that the simplest thing was to use the existing canon law on negligence, and they created a mechanism for doing that. Francis spoke about it last night on the plane. Bishops are now stood down if they cover up. It happens and doesn't have over the last few years. And so partly I don't recognise the picture in a way that's being painted here of a church that still tries to do things internally. It really doesn't, not in the last 20 years. It is a transformed institution. As soon as an allegation is made, it's immediately reported. This is true in the entire the church in the Western world. Then immediately the police and social services are brought in. And that is why we have had hundreds of priests who've been laicized and who are in jail. I mean, there is still a culture change that needs to take place.
We're going to put that argument to
talking.
Yes.
We have to take a very quick break. We're going to put that argument to the test when we look at the Pope's weekend visit to Ireland in a moment when we come back. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at troubled times for the Catholic Church and a Pope under pressure with our disagreements over which way to take church dogma and the sex abuse scandals that have rocked the church. The latest accusation from a hardline right-wing prelate accusing the Pope of covering up the misdeeds of the former Archbishop of Washington in the United States. We're talking about it with Father Aidan Troy, parish priest at St. Joseph's Catholic Church here in Paris. From London, journalist and commentator Austin Ivory, the author of The Great Reformer Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. And joining us from Durham in New Hampshire, Michelle Dillon, sociologist at the University of New Hampshire. Let's take a look, if you will, at that trip to Ireland, where misgivings run deep over decades of abuse that were uncovered.
Apologies don't really go far enough, and there needs to be accountability. People need to answer questions. They need to stand up, responsible for their actions.
I think it was an empty apology, and it's not good enough. And what we want is criminal prosecutions.
We want is criminal prosecutions. Before I ask you, Father Troy, let's listen to what the Pope actually said. He apologized for abuses in Ireland that ran over decades.
We ask forgiveness for the abuses in Ireland, abuses of power, of conscience, and the sexual abuses perpetrated by those with roles of responsibility in the Church.
Now, he spoke with the Prime Minister, who in his speech even suggested that the Catholic Church contribute to funding substantially, those are his terms, Leo Varadkar, to funding reparations for survivors of a former church-run orphanage where there was a mass grave of children's remains that was found.
Yeah, there's a huge tragedy. It is really so sad that these babies' bodies, it's in a place in the west of Ireland called Tuam, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of babies found. And there has been an incredibly brave lady who has researched the whole thing. The Minister for Children brought this particularly to the attention of the Pope when she greeted him at the meeting with the Pope, and she also gave him a memo of 2 pages outlining what needs to be done. And one of the things, it was Catherine Saponi is her name, the government minister, said that the Church must take responsibility and therefore must come in at some stage for redress. Now, how many we're going to be able to trace of that appalling tragedy? But while the
because this is just to remind our viewers,
sure.
took place. Most of those bodies date back, they think, to the 1950s.
Absolutely, it goes way, way back at a time when any girl who became pregnant was sent away. Not any girl. Sorry, I must correct myself. Some were sent away to a mother and baby's home. There were adoptions which have no paperwork. There are adoptions which have paperwork, but there were so many babies, and when they look at the record, the baby died of this, or else there's no record of the death, and there was no place for the no place where anybody could go and say that's. They were discovered in tanks, in septic tanks. It is one. I am profoundly ashamed even talking to you about this, but it's true. It has happened, and it has been revealed, and I think money will be very little consolation to anybody who's connected to that, but it's certainly, I have no problem saying that it should come into it.
Michelle Dunn? Dylan?
Michelle, well, just to go back to even what Austin was saying, I agree that there are other mechanisms within the Vatican for dealing with errant bishops. But the point is that the public doesn't see these. And as we saw with the Cardinal McCarrick story earlier, he wasn't expelled from the College of Cardinals. He chose to resign, even though the settlements with adults were made back, several years ago. So these are the sorts of stories that sort of sap away the credibility of church leaders, certainly in the American context. Then in Ireland, I think, yes, it's full of complications, as Father Troy has just discussed those awful stories, but also adding to complication in Ireland is really the strong complicity of the state and of culture and community in Ireland in the role of the church. And that's something I know is getting more and more disentangled over the last 20, 30 years. But, we have to look at the joint responsibility of church and state for how some of those people have been so awfully treated.
Austin Ivory, the Pope making the first visit by a sovereign pontiff to Ireland since 1979. He goes to a nation where they've legalized gay marriage, where they've legalized abortion. He's greeted by the first openly homosexual prime minister. And most importantly, he goes to a nation where fewer and fewer Irish are going to Mass. How did he handle himself?
Well, I think what he demonstrated in his, as he always does, with his humility, with his wonderful capacity for dialogue and for listening, he modelled the kind of church which Ireland now is, which is a church that serves rather than dominates. Nobody wants to go back to the days when the church was a very powerful institution because of its ties to the state, because a lot of the terrible abuses that happened are the product of that kind of culture. And whenever Christianity gets too tied to money and power, this is what happens. So I think he was modelling the church of the future, and I think he did it very beautifully. Now, a lot of the theme, of course, of the trip was concerned with abuse, not because he had to face it, because he chose to face it, because the pain is very real now in Ireland. And I think he did it in a number of ways. But I think the most beautiful one was what you've already spoken about, which was his decision after meeting the 8 victims on Saturday night to include at the beginning of his Mass yesterday in Spanish, which he always does when it's heartfelt, a beautiful apology, which was the product of that dialogue with the victims the previous night. That's the model of the church that he's offering us, a church that really listens above to the poor and to victims and who serves them.
One of the survivors he met with from that coalition of mother and baby homes described afterwards, when he spoke to the Reuters news agency, saying what the Pope told him. Let's listen.
When he was talking to survivors about cover-up and corruption in Rome itself, he literally referred to these people as caca. And his translator, again, was kind of shocked and asked the Pope to clarify. And the Pope literally did some hand gestures and said, caca, they are filth in a toilet. And he literally called these people shit. And we were stunned with that. And we felt that was a really important thing for him to do in the face of not just what happened in Ireland, but in the face of what's happening around the world and the grand jury in Pennsylvania, obviously, last week. That was a huge movement for the church, and I hope this is the start of something new within the church.
The hope that it's the start of something new. Michelle Dillon, you were saying earlier, the problem is the perception in public opinion, because we've had so many of these scandals uncovered now over the past 10, 20 years, is that we're always waiting for the start of something new. Has that something new really happened, really occurred?
I hope so, but it's very hard to say that it has. And I say this in part not because I want to criticize Francis, because I think he's doing in general a terrific job, even though I think there have been own goals over sex abuse, including, for example, the fact that I assumed he would end up meeting with abuse survivors. But in fact, we didn't know that he actually was going to do it until a day or two beforehand. And so this was itself a source of controversy for the last several months. Archbishop Martin was saying, oh, yes, he hopes he would, but nobody could confirm it. And I think these, to me, are missed opportunities, that whoever's advising the Pope, whoever's doing the logistics, both in Ireland and in Rome or whatever other country he's working with, that they need to be a little more savvy. I mean, it's not just PR. To me, this has been pastoral, that I would think that when he was putting together the logistics for his trip to Ireland for the World Meeting of Families, children are at the core of family life. There's sex abuse in Ireland and elsewhere. Surely a half an hour meeting with these sorts of families and individuals would have been a priority from day one. But again, I felt that was the church missed out and caused a lot of bad publicity because they couldn't say early on that they were going to do so. I hope it's a turning point, but of course Benedict wrote a beautiful letter back in 2010 to the people of Ireland, apologising for what he called at the time failures of leadership, which I took as a very strong letter, a very strong acknowledgement of contrition on the part of the Vatican for what had happened. But even with all the strides that Francis has made and the leadership he has demonstrated, we're still not where I think the church needs to be. And now, of course, then with these sideshows, if you like, with internal controversies among the bishops themselves and all kinds of politics and gossip, that's not helping the church's case.
Austin Every?
Oh, I just wanted to come in on this question of the meeting of the victims. Whenever he meets survivors of sexual abuse, it's never announced in advance. It's never planned in advance, precisely to preserve the confidentiality of the meeting. These are pastoral, private encounters. And the problem is that there are many abuse victims organizations which want to manipulate and use these meetings. There's obviously tremendous media interest in them. And the Vatican has just worked out that the best way of doing this, to preserve the privacy and the confidentiality, then if the victims afterwards, as happened in this case, many of them wanted to talk about it, that's fine, they're free to do so. But if they don't want to talk about it, that's also important. And worth also saying, and Francis confirmed this on the plane last night, this is nothing new for this Pope. He meets victims, he said last night, usually once or twice a week, several times a month.
Yes, I know. I'm aware of that because I follow Vatican news and other news closely, but most Catholics don't. And I don't think the names of the victims in advance or any of that should be announced. Absolutely, you want to protect the privacy and all of that. But if the Archbishop of Dublin could not say, even several weeks before the World Meeting of Families, that yes, there will be a half an hour or 30, whatever. But it was a back and forth as if the Pope himself was having reservations about it. I didn't think myself that he was having reservations, but that's how the story was disseminated. So I'm saying you don't have to release names of victims. You don't want all these different groups wanting an invitation, etc. I understand those pressures, but I think from the first day that the World Meeting of Families was announced for Dublin, it should have also said the agenda will include, yes, there'll be this mass, there'll be this, that and the other, and there will be a meeting space reserved when the Pope will meet with families and victims.
Michelle Dillon, I'm slightly haunted by something you said at the in part one of our show, which is how you described Catholicism in the United States, a higher clergy that's more conservative than the average faithful who attend Mass on a Sunday. And my question then is, which way is it going for the church? Is it going to become more conservative, or is it going to become more liberal as time goes on?
Well, I don't like to look in and predict the future, but all I can say is that American Catholics, a lot of Catholics, of course, leave the church. As we know, one of the big pieces of news from the US over the last 20 years are the number of Americans who choose not to have any religious affiliation, when it had been, unlike in Western Europe, it had been a very strong piece of everyone's identity, whether Catholic or Christian or some Jewish or some other religion. That's been a big sea change here in the larger culture. And of course, those numbers include ex-Catholics, if you want to call them that, people who no longer want to identify as Catholic. But nonetheless, a lot of people still want to be Catholic, and they understand that what it means to be Catholic is to go to Mass, not necessarily once a week, it's really once a month or more often now, sort of monthly has become the new weekly, so to speak, to go to Mass, to be part of the church. They love their church parish usually, they love community aspects, and they don't want politics from the pulpit, and they don't want politics from the bishops, for that matter. And so issues like gay marriage, divorce and remarriage, which is a very big issue in America, where you have so many Catholics who've had a divorce, who didn't receive an annulment or didn't apply to be considered for annulment. Nonetheless, they contract a second marriage, a civil marriage. They still want to be fully partaking in the Catholic Church and in the sacraments, and they really do want to maintain that identity. And so these are where the pressure points are. The Synod on the Family, which was successful, in my opinion, in helping push that conversation forward, has made some difference to them, but they really just want to get on with their lives. They want to have families, they want to work hard, and whether that, whatever jobs they're in and whatever kinds of families they're in, whether they're divorced, whether it's gay families, and they want the church's support. So this is why, Pope Francis really resonates with American Catholics in this sense, because he emphasized dealing with secular realities. And this is what they want. They're living in a highly secular environment, but they want their religion to still be part of that, and they're very attached to Catholicism. And if the church can accompany them on their various complexities and with their various complexities, well, that can only strengthen the church in the US, and I think in Ireland and elsewhere. But if we're going to have to keep witnessing, so that's enough,
Dealing with secular realities, you're saying a lot of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Here's one from Helen Marie. The Pope in Ireland has apologized again for the horrific abuse by clergy and nuns. It's a bit late, in my opinion. Something should have been done decades ago. The amount of victims is astronomical. As far as I'm concerned, she says, the Catholic Church is finished. Father Troy, is there the danger where you've just described Michelle Dillon there, explain how she sees the situation in the United States. Is there the danger worldwide that if there isn't more substantial reform, we're going to see the hardliners stay and the moderates leave?
I don't know. I watched. I wasn't able to go to Ireland, obviously, this weekend, but I watched, and two things struck me. One was there is still a huge interest in celebrating the Catholic faith in Ireland. Okay, the numbers in the Phoenix Park may not have been as great. I was back in Ireland for a number of weeks in the summer, and I went to Mass deliberately in different parishes around. I was absolutely amazed that there were so many. I thought they'd all be like me with grey hair or no hair, but in fact there were families there and that. Now, I know you can't build a theory on observation of one, but I think there is an underneath not only cultural but faith dimension still.
So which way does the Vatican go then?
Well, the Vatican, I think, has to go back to where there's people still doing very, very well as Catholics. I think the Vatican, and this is what I know it wasn't agreed with, but this is where I think the Vatican is still, in some sense, detached from what's happening on the ground. Honestly, and I've got some, as they say, some of my friends are bishops in Ireland, but the bishops in Ireland don't have a rating in the way that, for instance, the local priest, and I'm not in Ireland, so it's not me we're talking about, the local priest is often worshipped and adored and loved, and the local sister and the local brother. Now, the institutional clergy, we are absolutely detested, and rightly so. But the individual priest who's there, who's going with the senior citizens, who's going into the school with the proper safeguards there for First Communion, confirmation, they are still very highly regarded. And I would hate anyone to think that the Catholic Church in Ireland is finished. Nobody can catch, and I'm not sure the Pope Francis can catch, nobody can catch the enormity of what we have done as clergy and as religious and as others as well. And I do take the point with the connivance sometimes of the state. I think that's a point that was well made by one other country.
And have we reached this tipping point now where the catalogue is so large that the only way to restore faith is by eliminating celibacy for priests?
Oh, well, no, I thought you would never get onto this, Francois. I thought that you would never. It's too late for me. As I've said to you before, I'm too old and too ugly. I honestly think that could be used as an escape hatch. And I would like to someday talk to you with more detail about that, just to eliminate celibacy and leave the institution as it is, or just to introduce, God bless women, which wouldn't be fair to them, into this male celibate thing. I think we need to go back a little bit further to the gospel before celibacy. I've no problem. I think celibacy will go, but I don't think it's going to be the solution that a lot of people think it is.
Austin Ivory?
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, we have got a synod in the Vatican coming up on the Amazon, where it's expected that the idea that there will be married men who will be ordained in a particular region, I think that idea is already being floated. Here in England, by the way, we have, of course, married priests who are former Church of England priests, so it's not so strange. But I agree with Father Aidan. I don't think these things in themselves are going to make a huge difference. What really matters is what the Pope calls pastoral conversion. We have to change as a church from being an institution that's fighting for domination in culture and in the law to being a presence among people that washes feet rather than dominates, that serves, that heals, that pastors. And as Father Aidan was saying, whenever the church does that, whenever we're reaching out to the poor, standing with the poor, when we're humble, when we confess our sins, actually people find the Christian message basically compelling. So the major task, and Francis has been really clear about this, we have to introduce people to the experience of the encounter of the mercy with the mercy of God. Where we can do that, we have a missionary church that is set to absolutely to grow, be present, and continue to be a major presence in Western society. Where we're trying to cling, however, to old models and we're staring at the spaces that we've lost, we're going to continue shrinking. So I think we've got both dynamics at the moment. But one thing I'm absolutely clear about, and you can see this now in Ireland, is many of the statistics are showing that there is a real interest among young people. At the Festival of Families this week, there were more under 40s present, for example, than at the Festival of Families 2 years ago. You know, there are these signs, these new shoots, these green shoots that we're seeing. And I think this is what Francis is encouraging us to embrace. We're in a process of transition. I think actually it's a very dynamic and exciting time to be a Catholic, and particularly with this Pope.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Austin Ivory, I want to thank you so much for joining us from London. I want to thank Michelle Dillon for being with us from Durham, New Hampshire. And Father Aidan Troy, stay with us. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Yeah, it's quite a bit of an Irish flavour to the to the show this evening,
and rightfully so.
Certainly, a lot of buzz, Francois, about Pope Francis's trip to Ireland, and indeed beyond that. We'll get to some of the other aspects later. But just first of all, the numbers that turned out and the photos.
Yeah, there's been
contrasting images.
Some there's been a to and fro about numbers.
Right, and echoes of Donald Trump's these photos that were being contested. Was this a truthful image of how many people turned out on the mall, etc.? Well, you can see the image here in Phoenix Park in Dublin, where if you go back to 1979, it was 1.25 million people, which was extraordinary. I guess what we have to understand is that in itself was just an unbelievable amount of people turning up to see a highly charismatic Pope at that time, and certainly the country has changed a lot since then. And I think this contrast here is probably maybe a little, it maybe exaggerates it somewhat, but it certainly, the turnout was a lot lower than expected. Perhaps that was down to the fact that people were buying up tickets in order to take them off the market, if you like, even though they weren't, but people were buying up tickets or booking tickets because they were free in order to, I suppose, ensure that there wouldn't be a big turnout. But these are the figures here. Roughly 74% of the population turned up to some event or other in 1979, 1.25 million Phoenix Park. And the figures, hard to know for sure, but certainly under 500,000. That was a headline in the evening press going back to September 1979. And you can see there, again, quite a degree of contrast in terms of the coverage of Pope John Paul II's visit and Pope Francis's visit. Warns on the threat of secularism. You can see there in the bottom right, I think. Certainly secularism has grown in the last 30, 40 years. And here is another observer saying how he's stunned at how much Ireland has changed. Dublin on a Saturday afternoon, and how few have turned out to see the head of state of the Vatican. That's one image by, this is a pro-life Twitter account. They seem to kind of find the figures not altogether as bad as all of that. The Catholic Church in Ireland will never be broken. This is the only modern Ireland we need. And indeed, a lot of the TV images as well gave the impression that the crowds were quite big. But then it is that debate there, because you have others saying good effort on the cropping. Anyway, it would require more scientific analysis than I'm able to do on Twitter to get to the real truth of it. But I suppose what a lot in the Irish media are focusing on now is the extent to which Pope Francis may or may not have known of the details of what happened in one of the major controversies when it comes to church misdeeds and abuse. That is the Tuam Mother and Home situation, where infant bodies were buried in all sorts of awful circumstances. And the Pope officially kind of isn't really acknowledging that he knew anything about that. A lot of people find that hard to believe. The Minister for Children, Zappone, here, Catherine Zappone, confirming that she did tell the Pope about the headline in itself is awful, children's bodies in sewage systems of the Tuam home. In any case, a lot of people, such as this journalist for the state broadcaster RTE, Philip Boucher-Hayes, saying Pope Francis is seen here meeting Philomena Lee and Steve Coogan following a Vatican screening of Philomena, which was a film dealing with adoption and homes of that nature in the Catholic Church, and could it be that mother and baby homes just didn't come up in conversation? So again, there's a degree of scepticism about the Pope's official answer in that regard. Now, in the meantime, in the US, things are heating up also for Pope Francis. This just as he was kind of concluding his trip to Ireland on Sunday, news emerged that the ex-papal nuncio accused Pope Francis of failing to act on the McCarrick abuse case. That is the case of the former Archbishop of Washington, who has since had to stand down from the College of Cardinals. And he claims that Pope Francis withdrew sanctions against him, knowing indeed what had gone on, cases of certainly, alleged abuse in any case. And so some are calling it a cover-up. Right, and there is a whole debate going on right now about whether or not it is a cover-up. You have, I think, a bishop in Texas as well who's come out kind of saying, look, this is really a problem. But you have others then saying that Viggiano, that the letter exposes a putsch against Pope Francis. And if you go into actually the details of the letter, that they compare it, in fact, in this article to Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone and the assassination of President Kennedy, a trafficker in conspiracy theories who mixes fact, fiction and venom to produce something explosive but also suspicious. So there's a big debate within the church about whether or not these accusations are credible. But in any case, Pope Francis is remaining silent on it for now, as are a lot of others in the American church. But it looks like he's having to do firefighting on many fronts right now.
Indeed. Many thanks for that, James Creedon.